Okay, good evening, everyone. I just wanted to say my name is Trey Ventour, and I am a poet based in the UK. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who agreed to come to speak today, and also thank you to everyone that's come to spectate. I know in the UK we're in a heat wave, but we'd like to call it a heat wave. It's the result of global warming and climate change, and we're seeing the results of it. We need to probably get used to this as well. It's gonna happen more often, and I think talking about that now, it's really important to be a part of the event as well. So intersectionality and climate and colonialism, capitalism, like the industry and so on. The focus on economic growth over welfare, that's all part of the whole intersectional violence and so on. So I know it's boiling, and it would have been very easy to cancel this event, as it would be much easier just to relax and chill and do nothing, as what we're supposed to do during a heat wave. Whilst those of you watching from places like the US and Canada and other areas of the global south are used to hot weather like this, 40 degree heat, and so on. The UK does not have the infrastructure to deal with it. Our buildings are built to retain heat, so a heat wave, it's 40 degrees, but it feels like 50 in some cases. So this burst of hot weather is not a heat wave. It's state-led gaslighting. That's what I call it. When you see the media saying it's a heat wave, it's not. It's capitalism in overdrive, essentially. In other words, climate change and global warming. Climate justice, like anti-racism, the Me Too movement, disability advocacy, LGBTQ rights, the class struggle, and so on, all need to be intersecting together, working together, seeing how these movements have more in common than they don't. And anti-capitalism is at the heart of everything, in my opinion. Intersectionality then has developed under feminist theorizing and is rooted in a feminist understandings of power structures and knowledge production. It's essentially a way of analysing how structures of power emerge and interact together. Kathy Davis describes it as the intersection between gender, race, and other categories of individual lives, social practices, institutional arrangements, and cultural ideologies, and the outcome of these interactions in terms of power. Underpinning ideas then have been talked about before, as feminist studies and activism has a long history positioning gender in relation to other structures of violence before the concept of intersectionality was introduced or conceptualized in the late 80s. The first poet is someone I've only come into knowing about recently, but I'm already seeing the importance of her work, both in terms of creativity and in terms of social commentary. When she performed in Northampton the other week, I couldn't help but think about intersectionality and how vital that is to not only about how we analyze structural violence and discrimination, but also our own positionalities as people in the world, and how we approach subjects and interactions and so on. So is Hazel ready?
Hello, I am indeed.
She has been doing great things in London and performed in Northampton in May at the new monthly event Bespoke, run by Marley Lyman and colleagues, and her set really blew me away in Northampton. She's headlining the next Bespoke event on the 26th of July. So yeah, Hazel, take it away.
Sure, thank you for the incredible introduction. Amongst all of the other things I do in my life, I'm also a parent to two incredible children, Sophia, who has just turned 10, and my son Zekai, who just turned 7. And I have found raising them to be an absolute minefield. So I've got 2 pieces today, which very much relate to each of my children. I am Turkish Cypriot, and their father is Punjabi. He's from Kashmir. So we have to very similar and very different cultures that they are being raised with, in amongst the melting pot that is British culture. So my first piece, Tragedy, I wrote a number of years ago. It's still very relevant today. And it is an angry piece, which was written because my daughter has been experiencing racism since she was 4, within its many forms. Content warning, there is one use of a racial slur, which is generally used towards those of Pakistani descent, but it is very relevant to the piece. This is Tragedy. Where are the roots in race? A word unwittingly so rooted in hate that a mere act of apparent kindness unknowingly seals the fates of those not supremely white to be lesser faces, to be less worthy of a home and all its spaces. Trying to locate the right shade of beige for the title British, hoping this inherent racism is just a phase as my daughter casually accepts that England isn't a place which accepts her as its own. Disowned. Trying to figure out where she's from because Kashmir is a home she's never known, Cyprus just a holiday destination, but despite the Queen's English tipping her tongue, England being her home from the minute I crowned, the hospital she was born in South London found, she is told she is too brown. Too brown. Too brown, she is told she is too brown, and such is the innocence of a child that rather than allow a frown to grace her face, she smiles and is thankful for the friends she has from here who have said that they don't care if she isn't. Racism, always present. Tragedy isn't just found in violent protests on the streets. Tragedy isn't just found when asylum seekers capsize at sea. Tragedy isn't just found when those seeking refuge are locked away in detention centres. And tragedy isn't just found in the mouths of hate preachers outside courts or in town centres. Tragedy isn't just found in council cuts. Tragedy isn't just found in the empty bellies of kids with families who are down on their luck. Tragedy isn't just found in misinformation spread by mass media. And tragedy isn't just found in hate-fueled mass hysteria. Tragedy isn't just found on the sides of buses screaming that we don't belong. Tragedy isn't just found when diluting your culture is seen as wrong. Tragedy isn't just found on the disapproving faces of parents when we bring a Black boyfriend home. And tragedy isn't just found in white on coloured racism alone. It breeds. Whatever shade your face is, I can almost guarantee that at some point tragedy and hate has held it. Admit it. When our white friends used to play out past dark, growing resentment at our parents who wouldn't let us play that part. Preaching acceptance and understanding for anyone trans or gay whilst reassuring your mates that your kids could never be that way. Voting Conservative because you don't believe in handouts. Shaking your head at every man sat on a street corner asking for help with his handout. Preaching that it's only fair that one day this free healthcare runs out, but you round up by 25p the amount you pay for your burger at McDonald's in the name of charity. Pushing for a points-based immigration system, like deserving better can be turned into a game. Where is your shame? Don't tell me that just because you've been discriminated against, you aren't discriminating against anything you don't consider virtue. Living in a world where liberty really is just a statue, in a world with nations which still stone individuals for not conforming sexuality, race, gender, faith lost in a system in which conformity reigns more powerfully than the monarchy which colonized the world. Do not tell me equality is key when it has been thrown in the face of my little girl. British. Born and bred, we are in no way past the years of being shouted paki at or having kebabs thrown at our heads. We're searching for peace in pieces of a confused culture that doesn't understand that love is found when mixed and spread. Purity cannot be found in your bloods or in the thoughts in your heads. Open your hearts. Make today the start, be the change, stand up and take part, take ownership for the mistakes you have made and the ability you have to change the future. Do it for her, for our innocent daughter. Thank you. very much inspired by a series of true events, unfortunately. My daughter was told by two of her friends, one of whom was born and raised in France and then moved here, but of course was white, that maybe she didn't have lots of friends because she wasn't from here, but it was okay, they'd still be her friends. And that has clearly been heard from somewhere. My next piece is very short, but I'll let you know what we did to combat that. She thought she wasn't British because she was brown, because mummy was Turkish and daddy was Punjabi, she wasn't British. So we took a trip down the high street, so in our minds, of course, and I said to her, Sophia, I want you to tell me all of the takeaways, all of the restaurants that you think you'd see on a high street. And she went, Chinese. I went, yep, that's British. She looked at me. What? She went, kebab. I went, kebab's very British. There are many, many British people who have found themselves in a kebab shop at 2 o'clock on a Saturday morning. What else? She looks at me and she went, Indian. Curry's not British. I went, Sophia, curry is one of the most British things that you can eat. And, you know, she kept throwing them at me, and I kept telling her that each of these things are very British. And she then went to school the next day with like this real pride and a real sort of spring in her step. And she told her friends that she was from here. So it's beautiful. But my next piece I have is one that Trey has heard before, I believe. This is a piece called Brown Boys. And it speaks on the difficulties of raising my son and trying to do that whilst combating the influences of toxic masculinity found in both my culture and his dad's. So this is Brown Boys. You can't be different when you're brown. My son is told to hold his frown, to clench his fists and grit his teeth, to never show what lies beneath the surface, to hit first and talk later, not to cry when he falls, to be good at football, have girlfriends at school, no discussion, it's just rough and tumble, to be a boy who grows into a man. His path was chosen before he could stand. He could not play with dolls, given action men. Strong boys' colours like blue and red. He wanted to paint his nails like his sister, push dinosaurs in a pram. God forbid he play dress up, so don't tell him he can. He wants an earring, he can't till he's a man. Shoulder by shoulder with other brown boys he stands. You feed him your poison because you know that you can. Pass it on secondhand through more than the 2 generations now born on this land, when hits fly to women and knuckles are bruised and you try to decide which toxicity you choose, and here hate breeds. Like the vermin your dadaji left in the country he called home, and our son grasps at his anger and he's feeling alone. You say the power is yours till he holds a job and degree. But what does it mean to protect him from the white man and protect his culture, with racism and homophobia attacking like vultures identity of the motherland? Yet my voice is silenced, and all I can do is watch from the sidelines, but I will clench my fists and grit my teeth to allow my son his individuality. Son, your skin may be brown, but do not don the crown which will make you bleed. This is not what masculinity means. At 7, stand tall and act your age, and I will absorb those daggers with names like manly and proud and strong and brave. I will show you that this is not how you have to behave, with dinosaurs in your pram and colours on your nails and shin pads and studs and football shirts, and laughing at fashion shows in dresses and skirts with cuddles and kisses. Unfurl those fists. Relax your jaw. My brown boy will not be sent out side by side with others to war. He will stand up with his true sense of self, unrivaled self-worth, as he rough and tumbles in the dirt, and I will look at his smile with daggers in my back. Unwavering is his shield. I will not look back to the life I left behind when I chose to walk away. One foot on a new path with one which stays, and I will walk wherever his does lead. His path is different to his dad's, to me, and different is good, son. You will see. So together we stand, my brown boy and me. Thank you. And everything within that piece is so true. He loves having his nails painted. We went today to the salon and all of us got pedicures, and he chose the most beautiful, like golden shimmery brown color, and he's wearing it with pride. You know, I got him a pram for Christmas when he was 2, and I was told that I shouldn't have, and asked if I wanted my son to be gay. But in actual fact, my son just wanted to put all of his dinosaurs in his pram and push them around. And now, if anyone tries to tell him that he shouldn't play with something because it's for girls, he looks at them and he goes, I don't think this toy needs a vagina. And my mummy said that if it does, the kid shouldn't be playing with it. So yes, thank you so much. I have been Hazel Mehmet. I'll put my Instagram in the chat. But thank you so much for this space. I will be putting my kids to bed in 10 minutes, but I will be here and watching after. So thank you.
Thank you. That was really good. Thank you. I think on that topic as well, like I related to quite a lot of it when I was in school. Discrimination and bullying based on race was pervasive for me growing up, especially because I didn't go to school with really with any other Black or brown children. I was in one of my schools. I was the only Black child in the school, and so then racism to me was very evident as a dominant aspect of my childhood. So I'm going to talk for a bit more, and then I'm going to introduce Jen to the stage. He's going to talk to us about, she's one of the main featured speakers tonight, and she's not a poet, she's an academic, and she's going to be talking to us about critical race theory and policing. So yeah, when I was in school, when I was 9 years old at school, I was diagnosed with something called developmental coordination disorder, and it's known more commonly as dyspraxia. And it was only later in life that I started to investigate things like disability, neurodiversity, and all of the social justice issues that underpin those things. And it's in the last few years I was only being able to articulate my experiences of the world, that is disabling by design for me, and for also many students in school, what we now call SEN, which even of itself, special educational needs, is quite a problematic term. And because it puts the onus on the student rather than the wider system to not be the problem, essentially. But now I do identify as disabled, yet as a child, I had no idea about disability justice. So when I see children today, such as Hazel's children advocating for themselves, I see that as a positive step, particularly young Black and brown children, even now 2 years after the murder of George Floyd, which saw mass protests across society and the world. Though intersectionality was a term coined by Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw to define the experiences of Black women oppressed under white supremacy and patriarchy in the American legal system, it has gone on to encompass numbers of different oppressions on what we call a multi-pronged axis of violence. So a problem is not just a race thing or a gender thing or a class thing. It can be all of those things together, and together those things can compound themselves to create something really devastating. As a child, I was stopped and searched by the police when I was 14, which in hindsight, I now know to be an example of the adultification. We know that concept more in the idea of black girls, but it does happen to boys as well. There was a chapter on this by by someone called T. Dancy III, and it's called The Adultification of Black Boys. And I'll put a link in the chat to all the literature that I found on intersectionality. And it's in a book called Trayvon Martin, Race and American Justice, and it came out in 2014. Adultification, for those who don't know, in short, is when children are perceived to be more adult-like, analysed through deviance. Over time, they are seen as deserving victims and their vulnerability has been erased. This impacts Black children a great deal, who in many cases can be seen as more mature than their white peers and not considered through a safeguarding lens. The 2020 UK case of Child Q is a recent example where this
Black is so good for falling asleep, bro.
There's always trouble, isn't there? Hang on a minute. Is that person still in the Okay, so okay, I'm gonna start again. Child Q was a Black schoolgirl, and she reportedly smelled of cannabis, according to her school teachers. And the teachers then called the police. I think it was 2 white women officers strip searched her without the school informing her parents first. And now that child is traumatized and has a distrust in the police. This is an example of state-sanctioned sexual assault on a child, no less. Georgetown Law's 2017 study of adultification positions this intersectional oppression in the context of Black girls under the rubric of racism and misogyny, that Black girls are viewed to be more adult-like and more mature in contrast to their white counterparts. However, we also know this happens to boys as well, particularly as victims of police and the state. In a video for the National Association for Independent Schools, lawyer and scholar activist Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw describes intersectionality as multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage, sometimes compounding themselves and creating obstacles that are often not seen or understood through conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures that we have. She calls it a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. Adultification then, in the case of Child Q, could be thought of not exclusively as a racism problem or a misogyny problem, but both, where anti-Blackness and misogyny work together and compound themselves, showing how violence against Black women and girls cannot be solely blamed on racism or misogyny alone, but both. And in this context, I'm talking through very much a cisgender heterosexual lens. When we consider how this happens to Black women and girls who are gay, for example, this takes a different slant, which you can read on more from people like Audre Lorde, who wrote her 1984 book, Sister Outsider, from a Black lesbian feminist perspective. And she is quite explicit about her positionality in that text. And on that note, as I've taken us down a very sort of socially scientific route there, especially around policing, at a poetry event, as that is the norm at these sorts of events, where I like to combine the arts with social and political commentary, I would like to invite Jen to speak, who is much more of an expert on this subject, on race and policing, than I am. Jen, are you ready?
I am, yeah. Hiya.
I first met Jen via my friend and colleague Stephanie Richards, when they invited me to speak at the Black Criminology Network, and I think it was the summer of 2020. Jen is a practitioner within the British criminal justice system and a PhD researcher in criminology. Her focus is on policing and Black communities, and she is passionate about shaking up landscapes and structures to ensure environments encompass diversity, equality, equity, and inclusivity by supporting others. Jen is also the founder of Crim Talk, Community Interest Company, an initiative to support criminology enthusiasts by generating accessible content. She is also the founder of the Black Criminology Network, which aims to provide a space for those of Black heritage to network, learn, and achieve together. Jen, everyone, you've got slides, haven't you?
I've got slides, yeah. Sorry, I had to be that person, didn't I?
I'm going to make you host so you can present.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Right, while I wait for that to come through, does it come through? Sorry, I've not
I'm doing
presented
it right
before
now.
on Zoom. Fab, okay. While I do that, I'll just quickly introduce myself. So, here we go, I'm the host. So hi everyone, I'm Jen. That introduction like actually blew me out the water. I was like, oh my God, is he talking about me? Right, so yeah, I'll quickly share my screen and then, right, okay. There we go, share my desktop. Oh goodness, sorry, I'm gonna have to change my system preferences. Didn't think ahead, did I? Actually, how do I do this? Some academic I am, aren't I? Right, here we go. Sorry, I didn't realize I hadn't changed my settings before I came on. So I'm quickly doing that now and right, okay. I'm gonna have to leave the chat and then I'll come straight back in. So give me 2 seconds. This is a really, 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 really bad, isn't it? Okay, bear with me.
While Jen's setting up, I've just put the link in the chat to the resource document that I made on intersectionality. It's by no means incomplete, but it's sort of like an introduction to the subject. There's books in there, articles, videos, and so on. And anyone can access it and just share it around and whatever. It's a Padlet document, so you can actually watch. You can watch. I think you can watch the videos in the document as well.
Right, I am back. There we go, apologies. So I will share my screen now. Hopefully there's no issues. If you could, sorry, put me as the host again, please. Sorry.
Okay, you should be host now.
There we go, fantastic. Let's do this. Right, okay. Can everyone see my screen? You should be able to. Yeah, right, fantastic. So let's just go to the first slide and right, so I am going to be, let me just move this. Can I minimize it there? Fantastic. Right, so I'm going to be talking briefly about policing, intersectionality and critical race theory. So I am taking elements of my PhD. It was very, very, very difficult to cram my entire thought process and kind of the thesis that I've got so far into these 10 minutes. So there's probably a lot more that I could explore. However, I thought I'd take some pertinent points and go through them briefly with everybody. So just moving forward. So a little bit about me. I am a criminology PhD student and my thesis is titled Black Communities, Policing and the West Midlands. It's essentially a critical race theory exploration of community policing and Black communities in a nutshell. That's what it looks at. Me, myself, I know I might not look like it, but I have got roughly 8 years or so of working or volunteering across the criminal justice system. So that includes policing, prisons, courts, what else have I done? Yeah, just an amalgamation of all of those. And I'm also, as Trey's mentioned, the founder of 2 criminology initiatives, my little babies, I like to call them, the Crimi Talk and the Black Criminology Network. And you can find any of those online if you search for them. Right, so I just thought I'd quickly throw in some definitions, and it's not that I'm teaching you guys to suck eggs or telling you things that you already know, but these for me are personally my 2 favorite definitions in relation to CRT and intersectionality that I kind of embellished within my thesis as well. there are a lot more out there that relatively say similar things, or might be a bit more expansive or a little bit more concise. But for me, so critical race theory, a quote by Hilton, society is fundamentally racially stratified and unequal, where power processes systematically disenfranchise racially oppressed people. And then for intersectionality, and again, apologies, I know Trey's already given a definition, how intersecting even power relations influence social relations across diverse societies and individual experiences. That should say and not an, so there we go. And that's actually by Collins and Blige, not Bluge. So I just wanted to speak on kind of the changing face of policing. So within my thesis, I explore 4 themes. So I look at the history and context of policing as a whole. I also look at kind of policies, practices, legislations that have kind of brought us to where we are today in relation to kind of racial experiences and policing. And then I look at kind of advances within policing, etc. So I just wanted to talk mainly about the changing face of policing here. So in relation to policing and its origins and kind of how that all ties into CRT and intersectionality. So policing origins within itself were kind of birthed during the colonial period, so early 19th century. And this is something that I found relatively interesting within my thesis. So for me, just again, a bit more background around kind of what got me into doing my PhD thesis and stuff like that. I'm quite academic, I enjoy reading, etc. And I come from inner city Birmingham, so I've seen things in my life, etc. So I just really wanted to kind of get a conceptual understanding about some of the issues that, you know, my community face. And off the back of that, since doing my thesis and navigating my way through life, I've started to see other communities and other kind of intersections of society experience negative things. And for me, it was a question of, well, what really is the problem? It must be a systemic issue. So I started off by looking at some historical elements, and that's kind of drove me to then ask more questions and keep going back. So at the moment, I have proceeded actually now. At one point, I got back to the point of colonialism, etc. And I've gone a little bit further in the past, but we'll focus on colonialism. So just kind of looking at policing as a structure systematically, kind of when it was birthed during colonial periods, and we can imagine what society was like within Britain at that particular time. Also taking into consideration colonialism and the effect of policing globally, you know, the role of Britain and the empire, etc., you know, colonizing other countries and states across the world, and then, you know, implementing systems. So, you know, you see it across education, you see it within health, but you also see it within policing. So there are practices that you see in other countries that are still that were birthed out of British policing, out of Sir Robert Peel's principles. So that was basically the origin. And then obviously, as you move forward now, as technology has advanced, also policing has advanced. So you see a lot more, you know, social media engagements from police organizations and police forces, or police services, as they prefer to be called. You even see, you know, just small things, technological advances in what they wear, and, you know, the technology they use, devices, the clothes they wear. I've just said that. Vehicles that they drive, even things like body-worn cameras. And when you take these into account and you think of CRT and you think of structures and, you know, power dynamics, etc., it's a lot more to kind of digest than you would probably think. So again, just moving down the list, you know, you've got policies and practices and powers. So, you know, I think we can all think of, you know, the main ones in relation to power, you know, stop and search, use of force, section 60s, even tax legislation, terrorist legislation, So, you know, some powers that they have: surveillance related powers, policies, the new crime sentencing, police and crime sentencing bill, or act even now, but just the impact in which these particular things have on communities and intersections within said communities as well. These are things that often get overlooked in a policing context, and also diversity or lack thereof throughout the ranks. So following the death of, or should I say the murder, let's be quite frank, of Stephen Lawrence and the Macpherson report, it was also highlighted that police forces weren't diverse enough, or, you know, retention rates. And there's a lot of research out there that circumvents these points, and the lack of diversity throughout the ranks. And when you then think of that from a critical race theory point of view, and you think of systems and race, etc., it's not a level playing field. So then when you question policing and policing practices, which I'll move on to, when you then ask yourself this question, basically, how are CRT and intersectionality applicable in a policing context, you can then see how things unfold. So what might not seem like a big deal, so for example, like I said, your body-worn cameras might seem like such a small thing, but when you encompass that with the broader society and broader policing as a power structure, it has major implications, not just on policing as a function, but also the way in which they're perceived publicly and by intersectional groups. I'm intentionally today not talking about specific groups. However, I do touch on it heavily within kind of my PhD. One of the things I acknowledged especially was every community and every intersection has their own plight, and this needs shouldn't be overlooked as well within a policing context. So back to my list. So yeah, policing as a power structure, when you take into account CRT and intersectionality, it's very applicable to understand how the dynamics of policing, and despite Sir Robert Peel's principles at the time, and again, I'll throw out there in the era that they were created and for the people it was created for, there's always been this element of power dynamics. And when you look at a lot of events that have happened over the years in relation to different groups and different intersections that live within society and the treatment in which they've received from policing, even till this present day, there's always been that element of policing, power structures. So the kind of notion for me of Sir Robert Peel's principles of, you as a police officer, you are the public, it's very skewed, and there's a lot of like blurred lines in between that, and it just doesn't seem to work. And will it ever work? In my opinion, if it hasn't, it probably won't. No, it probably won't, it won't. Right, and then so again, when you look at incremental societal changes, things that have happened over time, changes in society, and police having to play catch up, and you often see that a lot of things may happen in society and police are like maybe 10 years behind, 5 years behind, 2 years behind. And there's a lot of research out there that kind of hypothesizes that and discusses that at length. And then a lot of malpractice and good practice. So again, when you take it into account CRT and intersectionality, we often see, obviously through media, through social media, maybe in your own interactions or what you've observed on your own, malpractice within policing. And there's also elements of good practices in places. But when you look at it from a structural lens, are these, for example, specific good practices being advocated for? Are they being pushed? And these incremental decisions that are happening with the powers that be usually at the top have major knock-on effects within intersections and specific communities and the diverse communities that you see day to day within Britain. So for example, it's not in this presentation, but there's something else that I delivered previously to universities where I speak much about kind of the different diverse communities and the experiences and the historical incidents or events that have taken place in their interactions with police, and trying to understand why there's a lack of trust, etc. So, and again, like I touched on it before. Right, so that, I got through that a lot quicker than I thought I would, and I've said a lot less than I thought I would. But again, here's a list of some of the references I referred to today. But if there's any questions, maybe, I don't know if we have time. But if you've got any queries or any points you want to raise, you can contact me either through social media, on LinkedIn, or you can just drop me an email. And I'm happy to talk a lot more at length about kind of what I actually include in my PhD. But again, I just wanted to throw it out there, the value and the importance of understanding how CRT and intersectionality and the value and importance of CRT and intersectionality within society and within all social structures that exist within Britain. And again, just one final point before I finish, sorry. CRT's obviously got a lot of origins within US structures and legislations, etc., and like a lot of their legal stratosphere, but it is transferable. And in a British context as well, looking at it from the UK perspective and through a UK lens, there's a lot of research out there as well. So if anybody wants kind of insight into that, I'm happy to share that with you as well on another occasion. So that is all from me.
Thanks, Jen. I think that point about America is really important as well, which I saw with the Black Lives Matter stuff happening in June 2020, where there were a lot of people sort of trying to put the US context of racism on a British aesthetic in that regard, when it doesn't fit so comfortably. And Britain has its own history of racism that is very different to the US. And I think with critical race theory and how it does have relevance in Britain, I think we also have to remember that the United States is a brainchild of Britain and European colonization as well. And I'll just give an example I'll give an example where the state of Virginia was named after Elizabeth I, who was the Virgin Queen. And a lot of the place names in America are named after British towns and cities. In Massachusetts, you've got Northampton. I think it's the capital of Massachusetts as well, if I'm not mistaken. So I think there's lots to be said about, yeah, America and Britain are very different, but they're also quite similar as well, much due to that sort of that history of colonization that both countries have not really recovered from either. So I'm going to read a poem and then I'm going to introduce the next act. Or yeah, I'm going to do that first. So I'm going to so I wrote this poem not too long ago because I got headhunted actually by Penguin Random House Books to take part in a book about Black history for kids, and I'm not really allowed to talk about it in depth, otherwise I will get libeled essentially. So I'm sorry, the poem, one of the poems I wrote for it, but I didn't end up using. So it's called I decided to write about Black autism. So hold on a minute. So where are the histories of Black autistics? An afterthought of white liars in the archives. My history sits lodged in the un-intersectional UK establishmentarian view of Black historical scholarship. But the archive I call Twitter are the history books of future generations of discourse beyond inaccessible academic chit-chat, threads and threads of Black #actually autistic people hanging off tweets of did you knows followed by stimmy Googling. Did you know Black autistics are real cool? Did you know autism appears differently in Black people? Did you know that SEN Black Caribbean boys eligible for free school meals in English schools are 168 times more likely than their white girl counterparts to be excluded? Did you know some of these boys are autistic? Did you know autism often comes with co-occurring neurological differences? Did you know autism studies have a whiteness problem? In the popular imagination, autism is infantilized white boys. You will not find these discussions at UK autism conferences, nor will you find these conversations in academic journals, as most studies are conducted by white neurotypicals. My autism is also in the paralysis of ableist white supremacy. It is being seen as deficient by other Black people. My Black history is not the same as theirs. Via my disablement, I sit on Hill Collins's oppression matrix. My body buried twice daily on the intersectional axis. In the history of Black people, disability is presented like a white ancestor in the closet, something many of us have, but don't talk about. For my collective history is also through the Nazis like Asperger's, Himmler, Goebbels and Heydrich, and concentration camps, Westerbork, Treblinka and Auschwitz. To be Black and autistic is to claim historic sites locked in colonialism and Nazi eugenics. To be Black and autistic is to not be autistic enough. No, I will not do an autism for you. But autism is for white youths. To be Black and autistic is to be told, you're not really Black. And Black history is for the newer majority. It's almost as if the establishment takes on Black history is more about window dressing, because if you write history books without sociological inquiry, that is sort of like whiteness as diversity. I'm told my history is in Musa and the Mali Empire, that when Columbus sailed the ocean in 1492, Mansa Musa was the richest man in the world. But didn't histories of disablement predate colonial logics as well? In Britain's coveting of Black excellence, my ideas of autistic pride and abolishing monarchy are passed over and pushed into the peripheries of intersectionality being applied to Black history. As to remember Black history would be to acknowledge that Black history doesn't exist in isolation, but histories of the LGBT+, women and autistics are also Black. To find my history would be to contemplate I'm discriminated against by Black people as well, where Black lives matter until they are intersectional. So when Black people, when people ask what my history is, it might be better to ask what is Black history without the rest. And that's that poem. And I've not actually titled that poem. So if anyone can think of a good title for the poem, I would be really grateful. A lot of poets I meet claim their work isn't academic or scholarly. Actually, poets are very good at unselling their own work, and they tell me like it's terrible and not very good, and then they go onto the stage and they completely kill it. And a lot of these poets have never performed before either. So they go onto the stage and it looks like they've been performing for years, and it's their first performance, and it always shocks me when poets do that. But it turns out that their poetry is also scholarly and also very good. And they do that because there's often been a teacher in school that has cast self-doubt into that person's mind about their abilities, even as a young child, as 4 or 5 years old. The power of educators is there. Many of you will be on Twitter following Liz Pemberton, and her handle is the Black Nursery Manager. And I know she's been quite vocal about this in early years. And even as in early years education, the power of educators as a tool to cast self-doubt into the minds of children, particularly Black and brown children, is evident. Even before they go to primary school, it's there in early years. And anti-racism in early years is something that needs to be done more in that sector. And when I meet them, people have this idea of what is academic, by what universities have shown them. But to me, academia is not a place, but more of a practice. And a lot of the people doing this sort of work are not lecturers as well. There are a lot of academics who work independently and aren't attached to universities. And I think students also forget that too. So I've been doing poetry since I was 14, and the numbers of poets I meet would also be great journalists and academics. It's monumental. Large amounts of spoken word is political, and really spoken word is just journalism in bars, to be honest. That's how I would describe it. There's history in there, as well as sociology and criminology, and a lot of the poets that I meet talking about this stuff in their poetry, they're commentating on the world. And in a lot of contexts, that's what sociology does and what criminology does, just in a more extended form in terms of like essay writing and so on. Okay, the next poet, I met this person many years ago, and they introduced themselves as Rafi. So we're going back to 2012 now, and today this person, I identifies as plural. We met in a Facebook group revolving around our enjoyment of the work of J.R.R. Tolkien, and even today I still have a soft spot for Lord of the Rings and anything Middle-earth related. The next poet is plural, and the author that will be presented today is Zal, a surrealist poet, author, illustrator, and filmmaker from Hyderabad in India. They are the creator of Epidre, a surrealist literary and artistic universe. For more info on this universe, I'm sure Zal will be too happy to talk to you about it. I went to India in 2016 to meet them for the first time, staying with them and their family. Zal now resides in Ottawa in Canada, so naturally I went to Canada in 2018 and where we met again. I'm really proud that I'm able to call this person actually my oldest friend, actually, and one of the greatest human beings that I know. As far as intersectionality goes, we have talked about this at length, and this person's experience is incredibly unique within the frame of intersectionality. They're Indian, Pakistani, and of Uzbekistani heritage. They're an immigrant into the global north, so into guess what we call white nations, so Canada in this aspect. They are an ex-Muslim, as they left the faith years ago as well. They're plural and also identify under the neurodivergent, so the neurodiversity paradigm, and much more. Together, also Zal and his alters identify as genderqueer / non-binary, but each individual alter has their own unique pronouns too. Is Zal ready?
Yeah.
Awesome. Give a hand for Zal, everyone.
Thank you so much. You are always a sweetheart. I don't know what else to talk about myself that Trey hasn't spoken already. But the poem I'm gonna be presenting, I wrote this yesterday, just because I was trying to think what I could write, and I kind of merged an older poem that I'd written about going beyond my own intersectionality with some of my thoughts and ruminations that I have on a daily basis about the nature of identity and my place in the world, and where I am at the intersection of myself and my other selves and the world outside. So here it goes. Who am I? According to René Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Perhaps I think too much, because I am at once more than enough and nothing at all. I know my gender is fluid, my attraction beyond identity, my capacity beyond binary. I know I am an inexhaustible summation of all that I've ever heard, seen, touched, smelled, tasted, spoken, remembered, imagined, and dreamed so far. I am at once my own person and part of a system. I am also pulled in between, at the center of everything I have ever experienced, observing myself from the perspective of everyone else. In the physical world that is not confined in my skull and is not dependent on my survival, I do not know everyone, and I do not know everyone well enough in this present. And in the future, though things might change, I may never fully understand why everything that has happened has happened. At these intersections, I am existential. I'm infinitesimal, I am abysmal, I am terminal. Time is beyond my grasp, stolen by insatiable consumption that only seeks expansion. Exposed to greater awareness of how everything works and of myself, I feel smaller and more vulnerable in my own skin, wanting to run away from all that wishes for me to lose and all that wishes for me to win. Here, I attempt to absorb everything I come across from the moment I wake up to the moment I sleep. Here, I attempt to process everything I imagine in the liminal spaces of my dreams. Every day I stand here at these existential intersections, questioning the decisions made by myself and my headmates, and questioning the decisions made by people we interact and do not interact with. I question the reasons, the motives, the emotions, the ethics, and the intent of everything in my knowledge. I can't help but recognize, analyze, scrutinize, and philosophize every bit of information that enters through my senses. At these existential intersections, I'm insignificantly small, though many times heavier than my own mass. Here, I don't matter at all, yet I'm inundated with everything that is matter or comes from matter or becomes matter. Here, I am acutely aware of every fault, flaw, failure, error, and mistake. Here, I'm in the direct line of every criticism, taunt, gossip, curse, cackle, and lashing. Here, I'm always processing how everyone else out there is going through the same but reacting to it differently. Here, I'm fawning, fleeing, freezing, and fighting every unfolding of fate, wondering if everyone else is also engaged in one of these states of self-defense. Here, at these crossroads of consciousness, I loathe and lament the decisions made by individuals who do not self-reflect, introspect, and restrain themselves from acting out on their thoughtless interests, addicted to a sense of power from fear and fervor of those involved in the high stakes of recklessness. Here, I'm terrified of those who terrorize everyone else with their gathered rage. Here, I'm wary of the othering by those who weaponize hate. Here, I'm not ready to relinquish control, obsessing compulsively on every little thing around me, hyper-vigilant, hyper-aware, hyper-reactive to every change, always trying to stay one step ahead from the next mishap, next accident, next trauma, next abuse, next panic, next seizure, next crisis, next loss of control. Because in a world so intricately connected and so impossibly inundated with disinformation and misinformation and so caught up in chaos of ceaseless, complex, intersectional conflict, I am worried for the people who suffer around me and within me. I feel helpless, hapless, and hopeless about our collective anguish. I feel hounded by the outcomes that await us if we don't stop this apocalyptic descent into collective suicide by this steep turn to anti-science, anti-equal rights, anti-inclusive sentiments. There's so much to take in at all times because the world beyond my safe spaces is battered and broken by the binary. The polarization of the human experience pummels us towards a sixth mass extinction. Apathetic activism is advertised as empathy, equality, and equity. Reparations, rewards, and relaxation are promised plenty but rarely put to practice. We are instead put out to pasture, left alone to defend ourselves against everything else. Pseudoscientific fanaticism, fascism, and greed-driven injustice encroach upon our boundaries. Those who don't care about the planet are raising borders to prevent us from exercising our rights and freedoms as they should be, twisting policies with policing tactics to deny us access to sustainable science for all, to pull back rights for gender, sexual, romantic, and ethnic minorities, leaving our health, shelter, and sustenance to the uncertainty of a collapsing climate and the society that relies on it to exist. But it's not enough to be anti-racist. It's not enough to be decolonial. It's not enough to treat everyone equally. It's not enough to care for all the other species we share all our resources with. My mind says people from all walks of life need to co-create a vibrant culture that celebrates plurality of thoughts and identities, coexisting sustainably in peace with everything else in our intersectional ecosystem, exploring existence with endless curiosity of a child. I want to fix these fatalistic missteps. I want to help people reconnect with their better selves, but this is just an impossible dream I've conjured. Unfortunately, science will never become the catalyst of our purpose, nor will equality for us to get together. We will be blindsided by self-manifested entropy at the cusp of discovery of ourselves. Because how can we even make any difference if we collectively don't come to the same conclusions about the very core aspects of our existence? How can we fix anything if we don't even stop being in denial about ourselves? How can we bring everyone together when all we do is fixate on our differences? How can we accomplish anything if we are so focused on what we present to the world outside and what we do to forget about all that hurts us? How can we healthily communicate with mutual empathy if we always try to be perfect and exceptional? If we always try to protect ourselves and escape? I ask myself these questions over and over and over again as unconsciously and as effortlessly as my breath. And even when I regulate what I inhale and what I exhale, I don't feel entirely in control of all that is experienced by my headmates and their own fragments, all that is felt by me as an extension of their conjoined selves, and all that I come across on the internet or in my physical realm. There are no directions left to follow or exits to take. All doors and all roads have led me to this junction between Jungian archetypes and Darwinian impulses. I've sought answers in all schools of science and spirituality. I've accepted and abandoned all concepts of a creator. I have expressed through all mediums of art and reasoning. I have grounded myself in facts and formulas. I've attached myself to evidence of the evolutionary nature of existence. I have engaged with and expressed all genders, sexualities, relationships, and identities. I have been open to understanding where all viewpoints emanate. I've been adamant to only associate with that which equally denounces all that is wrong. I have choreographed all possible brushstrokes to paint a picture that speaks a simple story of no woe and worry. But it is always spoiled, slashed, and set aflame, leaving me to gather the countless shards over and over again. So I return to the crossroads of these infinite horizons to ruminate about myself. The endless sea under my feet is always shifting, always moving, always swirling. The endless sky above my head is always transforming, always yawping, always whirling. There are mountains of memories all around me, made of all those inside and outside of myself. They're unlike me, yet they all share something in common with me. They're also confused, conflicted, cornered, and burned out. They also want to just be safe. I dissociate myself from the human experience, hence, and fantasize how it feels like for a caterpillar to melt into a goo and recreate itself anew, or for an octopus to reflexively change its hue, or for an atom to glue itself to a molecule. And I rue the limitations of who I am. So here at the quandary, I decide to go beyond all intersections of myself and ask, who am I when I'm all alone at the end and start of the day? Who am I when everything that I know is stripped away? Who am I when every interpersonal construct created by communication and conflict is absent from my thoughts? Who am I without the things I enjoy, the things I interact with, the things I consume, the things I've done, the things I've bought? Who am I when I have nothing new to do? Who am I without my partners, families, friends, pets, co-workers, acquaintances, strangers, and people I know who don't know me? Who am I when all the intersecting, overlapping, and fragmenting social groups of professions, ideologies, sustenance, and identity are erased? Who am I without the awareness of all schools of existential science, undefined by labels and language, the information I use to make sense of my surroundings, the senses I depend on to tether myself to register everything else? Who am I when I remove myself from everything that I think is false and everything that I think is true? Who am I when I no longer think of all that is past and all that is yet to? Who am I devoid of all the rituals, rules, and tools we have invented to execute all the tasks and all the distractions that keep us going on? Who am I without the concept of creation and the knowledge of everything that has existed and everything that exists and everything that will not? Who am I without my emotions and expressions? Who am I without the realization of my reflection? Who am I without my memories, my fantasies, my dreams? Who am I when I can no longer feel? Who am I without all that I've suffered? Who am I without a purpose? Who am I without the biases of my impulses? Who am I without all the lies I tell myself? Who am I without the acute awareness of the atoms that form my inner and outer existences? Who am I in these lucid seconds of living death? Who am I in these liminal moments of nothingness? Who am I in the absence of myself? Who am I without the concept of self itself? The answer will most likely never materialize itself. I don't know where to go from here because I am already at the center of my absolute emptiness, waiting for the songbirds of solitude to sing of stillness and silence, waiting to disintegrate into the absence of non-existence, no longer thinking, therefore free from the crushing awareness of myself, therefore no longer being an I, therefore no longer being Zal. Thank you.
That was really good. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I wrote it literally yesterday evening. Uh, I was thinking about a lot of different topics to write about based around intersectionality, but then I was like, a lot of things that I might be speaking about are already being covered by other speakers who might also be in a better position to speak about it. So I wanted to just inspect my own self.
I think you've done a really good job there of writing a really unique poem as well, on a topic that a few people will be able to replicate as well, and I think that's what poetry is all about too. And I'm so glad it was recorded, so we can go back and revisit it too. So yeah, thank you for that and for agreeing to perform.
Thank you so much.
So this idea of intersectionality then is one of the core tenets of critical race theory, and it continues to give some closure for I think quite a few people probably in the chat about where we fit in the world. And as for me personally, it's given me some sort of closure of where in terms of belonging and acceptance and so on, something I didn't get when I was a young child. But again, feminist theorizing comes into play, and seeing the words and what's been theorized, you can sort of put your own personal experience into a lot of these texts. And where I fit in the world does not really come with nice boxes. It comes with multiple boxes that morph into each other, and that frequently creates problems for institutions and organizations that really try to collate the human experience as something singular and not multifaceted or complex. So the complexity of the human experience is something that isn't really sought after by organizations. They want simple answers to complex questions a lot of the time. And when you come with complex answers to complex questions, it gets them a bit upset. And it was in 2016 when I met many autistic students at university and began to explore autism in that regard. Where I also decided to self-diagnose, because numbers of autistic students, they just assumed that I had a diagnosis and I didn't. And I graduated university in 2019 of my undergraduate degree. And then I became a sabbatical officer for Black and Brown students at my students' union, where I met more students who identified with the many different neurotypes under that term, neurodivergent, so autism, dyspraxia, dyslexia, ADHD, even bipolar as well, because it also includes some mental health conditions too, and many more. So working in student unions, it became clear that numbers of students that came to me for help as well were Black British women. They came to me to discuss racism on university campuses, namely what we'd call misogynoir, essentially anti-Black misogyny, first coined by Professor Moyo Bailey in 2010. But of course, that has a much longer historical lineage, going back to colonial enslavement and the treatment of enslaved Black women on plantations in the North American colonies. And if you want more reading on this, I recommend the book Misogynoir Transformed, Black Women's Digital Resistance by Moya Bailey. And there's a link to that in the chat. I put the Padlet document in the chat again. So if you click on that, it's got a whole resource list of reading and sources. And that book is on it as well. There's also the 2019 book, which is also in the chat. They were her property. White women are slave owners in the American South, by historian Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, which is also really good. There's also Black Feminism Reimagined by Jennifer Nash. Also, I think going back to Audre Lorde, things like Sister Outsider come to mind. Pretty much the entirety of Bell Hooks's work as well is also worth looking at. Angela Davis's Women, Race and Class, and even Angela Davis just talking about anything is worth looking at. So there's some of the texts that you can probably start with. So Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw coined this term intersectionality, but there are authors and also revolutionaries who were talking about the practice of it before she came up with the term. Before she came up with the term to define it. And on that topic of revolutionaries, I'm going to introduce you to another poet. This poet's name is Obsidian, Adebayo. And I first met this person in possibly 2017 or 2018 at an event run by Soul Food Poetry. I think it was in London at the time, who run events in Bedfordshire, London and Amsterdam. And even back then, I knew they were pure energy. And since I've watched this person go from strength to strength, they were the head of commercial at Galdem Collective, the institution that prides itself on platforming the voices of women and non-binary writers. And they also founded the international platform Black Monologues. More recently, they became the corporate strategy lead at the LGBTQ+ organization Pink News. People say that I don't stop and I'm always busy, but Obsidian Adebayo makes me look quite slow in comparison, actually. I can't recommend this person enough. Also easily one of the most intelligent people that I've met in doing poetry or academia ever. So I want to welcome them to the stage, please. Yeah.
That was very kind. Thank you. It's very, very hot, guys. And, you know, so I'm sorry. At first, I was just like, I'm not going to wear clothes. I'm just going to sit here until I need to put on clothes. To be honest, I've gone back and forth in my mind about what would be good to perform. I think a lot of my poetry is through the lens of interpersonal relationships, and it contends with race and sex and gender. Less so sexuality, actually. I do have some pieces around that, but a lot of my pieces like speak to like specific events, and I've used them as a way to sort of process some things that have happened to me through my life. So I have a really old piece that I did actually when I studied at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, so in the States. And one of the modules I did was Black Women in the Diaspora. And we had, well, one of the electives and one of the classes was around intersectionality. And our professor said, you know, if you could write a poem, told everyone if you could write a poem to describe your sense of feminism. And so I wrote this when I was 19. Believe it or not, I'm 31 this year. I know. But like, it was when I was much younger, and I find it interesting even reading back to sort of see where my mind was then. So I think I'll do that one. And another one is actually more speaking to the recent overturning of Roe versus Wade. and my personal experience with that. So that might be the other one that I do, but we'll see how it goes. So this poem is called My Feminism. My feminism can be the downfall of me sometimes. The principles I've grown up with, second generation Nigerian, born in a country that stripped the culture of my heritage. The blood running through me is red, but it seems the pigment of my skin is more important than the common life force within. I was brought up told that woman's place is in the home, that the husband sits on the throne, and I should be his silent queen beside him. The contradiction being, the silence means my position means nothing. He speaks, I listen. He speaks, I listen. He speaks, I listen. A good wife is a wife that knows submission. Funny how culture seems to have been replaced by a religious system. My grade as a female is based on the Proverbs 31 woman. Maybe this is bad math, but I believe 3 and 1 equals 4, which I believe my man should be to me, for my development, for my empowerment, for my position. I mean, so for it, that's why he married me, isn't it? But does this mean my mindset has become westernized? Does this mean that I have become blind, rejecting my skin tone and adopting a white mind? Yet the culture that has now become religion is how I've been defined. My feminism will overcome this dichotomy, because my feminism is my own conglomerate of analogies. My feminism is the experiences of growing up as a young Black female youth and the experiences I'm yet to go through. It's the racism and bullying I faced in high school, put into the context of a Nigerian home with a cheating father while dating a Nigerian-born, recently naturalized partner, and watching and learning to understand the struggles of my mother. Bringing up a child in a Nigerian way within a British culture. It must have been hard for her. Prodigal daughter, trying to find her own way in this ever-changing diaspora. I mean, who am I really? This intersectionality within me, each stage of my life a new crossroad of self-discovery. My environment and my bloodline, like the River Thames, is the River Nile, and like Big Ben is a constant reminder again and again that I'll never really belong to either side of the Mediterranean. Never quite sounds right. Yoruba with a British accent, intonations absent, like jollof rice without the spices. If it was the other way round, noughts and crosses, civil war of the mind, half of a yellow sun, purple hibiscus, we shall overcome. I'm not a descendant of slaves, but I sure do act like one. Colloquialism on my tongue, humming along to rap songs. Lauryn Hill, MTV Unplugged, rejecting Fella while embracing the portrayal of myself in the media. The white people have redefined me. Things fall apart, Chinua. But it's not all bad. I've come to a conclusion, to pick the best of both worlds, an Afro fusion, be the best me I can be, all seven definitions of Fumi. Oluwafumilayo, Temitayo, Ayoluwa, Titilayo, Morayo, Fulola, Adebayo. My feminism is how I so choose to define it. My feminism is me in an ever-changing climate. My right to live my life however I wish to decide it, and letting nobody or nothing try to confine it. So I wrote that when I was 19. And it's interesting to see how my journey has like moved dramatically since then. But I think it was relevant to speak to a time when you have all of these identities that like are put on you, or you're told what you are. And then as you grow up and as you learn more about the history of these things, you realize that actually a lot of your sense of what these cultures are just a reflection of the environment that was around you. It's not necessarily what that culture is, but also inherently being part of that culture means you have a right to define it in your own image as well. It's not something that is happening to you. You are part of it and you can help change it and shift it. So that's where that was coming from. I might, okay, no, I'll do this one. It's a heavy one. It's trigger warning around abortion. It's my own experience. I wrote this when I was in Colombia, when I was 26, 27. I quit my job. I was working in investment banking, and I didn't realize that this was something that I hadn't processed. So the years that I refer to at the time is referring to that period of time. But yeah, this poem is called Goodbye. The moment I knew you were growing inside of me, I cried. I cried for so long and so hard, I honestly thought I was going to die. I couldn't love you, not when I didn't love myself yet. I knew if I had you, I couldn't hug you, not when I woke up every day in pools of sweat. Your life would have been full of neglect, a life that shouldn't have been spent, a life I wasn't ready for, a life I didn't expect. I was in so much pain, and on reflection, I wonder if you felt the same. Could you sense that I didn't want you? Is that why you drove me so insane? Is that why the doctor told me that I couldn't have you anyway? You were ectopic, so they told me you couldn't be saved. Did you stop short in my tubes of love because the journey was too tough? Were you suffocated by the idea of what you would become? Neglected? I wouldn't have had the space to love you, and I felt ashamed and pathetic. I was sick with my own shit, and I think you felt it. That's why you grew up in the way a child would, of a mother who couldn't accept it, a mother whose very body was rejecting you. I think you knew I wasn't ready. I think you knew that I wouldn't let him rub my belly. I think you knew I wouldn't have been a steady pair of hands. I had nightmares that I'd throw you up and hear the thud of you land, because I would forget to catch you while I tinkered around with all my plans. Plans that didn't account for mini-me, somebody just as complicated, their own worst enemy. I confided in your father that I'd rather it this way, because we hadn't yet learned how to be partners in any case. You would have been 5 years old. And truth be told, sometimes I wish I had the guts to see you grow. When they scraped the very idea out of me and I screamed out in agony, I think a part of me actually did die. That moment looking up into those bright yellow lights is frozen in time, a wound that still bleeds as much as that very day. I couldn't even look at myself the same, but I was afraid. I thought I'd be an awful mother. And I didn't want to raise a child knowing we'd hate one another. I wish before they opened me up that I told you how much you were loved. But I guess that would have felt insincere as they lifted my legs up. When I continued the bleeding, I felt the blood was your tears from a destiny I cheated you out of because of my fears. I'm sorry you never even got to my womb. I'm sorry that in my heart there was no room. I'm sorry that we never got to meet. I'm sorry that I never gave you the gift of being able to see anything but darkness. I'm sorry that I made you a carcass. I'm sorry that I never got to give you a name. I'm sorry that your life only caused me pain. You never got the chance to show me you love me, and I never got the chance to show you the same. I'm sorry that I wasn't prepared. I'm sorry to all the women who don't have partners who care. I'm sorry that it's a woman's burden to bear. I'm sorry that men are able to dictate as they fixate on whether or not a woman should even have the option. I'm sorry that so many leave due to emotional malfunctions. I'm sorry that I even had the choice. I'm sorry that I never got to hear your voice. I'm sorry that this poem was necessary to heal. And I'm sorry that you aren't here to hear it because you knew more than anybody that our pain was real. Please know that you'll always be mine. And I never got the chance to say it then, but I love you and goodbye. So yeah, I think sometimes the narrative around abortion misses how complicated that is. And of course, you know, in my case, there were health issues, for example, being ectopic, but sometimes you're just in a position where you can't afford it. And I was dealing with heavy anxiety and depression, and I didn't feel I had the support of my partner at the time either to even facilitate it. But I carried so much guilt because I felt like because I didn't want the child so much, that's why, you know, the pregnancy was ectopic, but I think it speaks again to how, I mean, of course, we know that Black women in particular are disproportionately at risk of death, in childbirth, and how they engage with healthcare services. And I remember how dark that time was because I was working at the time, and I was in so much pain, and I just was like, I just can't do this. This is not something that I can handle. And so when I see narratives out there, I think, it dehumanizes the whole experience. So I just felt it was important to share. So that's me.
Thanks for that, Obi. I think it's important to say as well that for us in the UK, let's not, I guess, extradite Roe v. Wade as an US problem, because it's you look at how the state has been acting in the UK, and to me, Roe v. Wade could easily happen. In the UK context, we've seen how the state has treated asylum seekers and immigrants under the Borders Act. And when we look at the police crime and sentencing bill, which now has become the Courts Act, which is now law, again, state violence is going to permeate through Black communities, again, with increased stop and search powers. And also the Courts Act has basically criminalised being gypsy woman traveller as well. So the Roe v. Wade, again, in the UK context, it would underpin the government's anti-trans rhetoric as well. Their attacks on trans lives, if they were doing anti-abortion, it would attack specifically LGBT plus community, cis women, but also intersex people and trans men as well. And it permeates through the government, but also state-owned media as well, and how they've been going after transgender people too. So before I knew about any of the literature around intersectionality, I'd seen it in practice a bunch of times, but I didn't have the language to describe it. However, within LGBTQ plus communities, the man who was my mentor since I was 16, so I'm sure he would never call himself that, is a Black American guy. And it was through him I came into contact with the work of Bell Hooks, who identified as queer, pas, gay. And so pas being the French word for not, so queer, not gay, as well as being encouraged to seek out Black, specifically Black trans histories as well by him and many of my LGBT friends who are more knowledgeable about this than I am. Histories of trans people in the US tend to spotlight white trans people like Christine Jorgensen, and while she got famous as one of the first to undergo gender confirmation surgery in the 1950s, Black trans people were erased from that history. Jorgensen appealed to the dominant norms of white womanhood. For example, respectability and heterosexuality, managing to create that separation between white trans people and Black gender variant people, where the media also ridiculed Black trans women as failed attempts to emulate Jorgensen as well at that time. In effort to fight white supremacy in erasure of knowledge production as well, academic Dr. C. Riley Snorton highlights examples of Black trans resistance in his book, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, which is on the link as well on the Padlet document. Snorton is a scholar activist whose work focuses on historical perspectives of gender and race, specifically Black trans identities. This book in particular includes historical examples of Black trans resistance to the American legal system, including Mary Jones in 1836, Jim McHarris in the 1930s, Lucy Hicks Anderson in 1945, and Ava Betty in the 1950s. More recently, we know about Marsha P. Johnson, who has become memorialized essentially as the face of the Stonewall uprisings of 1969, protesting police violence at the Stonewall Inn. Alongside Johnson, there was Sylvia Rivera, a Latin trans woman who was a sex worker and activist in New York City. only 17 when she helped lead the Stonewall uprisings. She also co-founded the Gay Liberation Front. This took an anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-sexism stance. And she also challenged the fact that gay liberation movement was biased towards the liberation of white middle-class gay and lesbian people, and advocated for the inclusion of people who were intersectionally marginalized within LGBTQ+ communities, including Black and brown people, transgender people, poor people and homeless people, and also incarcerated people in prisons as well. At a gay pride rally in 1973, she expressed her desire to include trans and other marginalized groups in the gay rights movement. And this became known as her Y'all Better Quiet Down speech. I think what she was saying there about it being biased towards middle-class white lesbians and gay people sort of has similar resonance today still, from what I hear about from my Black and brown gay colleagues, that gay liberation today still centers whiteness. And that also provoked a need to have things like Black Pride and so on. Furthermore, you've got Miss Major Griffin Gracie, who was a Black trans woman who helped shape trans rights in the US, growing up on the south side of Chicago in the 40s and 50s. She left for New York in the early 60s after facing transphobic discrimination and violence. She was homeless for several periods of time and used theft as well as sex work to make money. Like Johnson and Rivera, she also took part in the Stonewall uprisings, where a police officer broke her jaw and knocked her unconscious. I think, I can't remember who was saying it earlier about how a lot of these issues impact people more than just race, especially when it comes to policing. We've got more in common than we don't. Police brutality is not just a Black issue. It's when you start looking at police violence historically, you will see that it affected women, gay people, the working class. The formation of the London Met in 1829 was in part actually in response to working class resistance. And basically the job of the police is to police the streets, and the people that live on the streets or within the streets are poor people, working class people. You don't find rich, wealthy elites on the streets in that regard. So the job of the police is to police the streets and who owns the streets essentially. So that was to police poor people and so on, and working class people in the 19th century. So we're thinking in the context of Dickens's era. Think about stories like Bleak House and Oliver Twist and the sorts of things that Dickens writes about in those books, about the streets and London in particular at that time. I'm gone on a tangent there. Gracie was incarcerated for 5 years and in the late 70s moved to California to continue her activism. In the 80s and 90s, she continued her activism, addressing the needs of the people that were required in the AIDS epidemic. She was also a supporter of prison abolition, much like people like Angela Davis, who was also a big supporter of prison abolition too. Now she is 81 years old and is still much an activist and community organizer with a specific focus on Black and brown women. Also within that time, you had Stormé Delivari, who was a biracial butch lesbian born in 1920 during the Jim Crow era in Louisiana. She moved to Chicago at 18 and came out as lesbian at that time, and founded North America's first racially integrated drag touring company. She was at the Stonewall Inn the day the uprising started, and when police raided, she punched one in the face, and then she was accosted by 4 police officers who then handcuffed her. When one hit her with his baton, that's when the rioting started. It was because of this biracial person that Stonewall occurred, and her work as an activist continued over 30 years, working as a bouncer in New York, lesbian bars, protecting lesbians and lesbian spaces, continuing this work into her 80s, but then dying at 93 years old in 2014. Similarly, in Britain, you had people like Pearl Alcock, who was a bisexual Black person, sometimes remembered as the she-bean Queen of Brixton. She was an artist and ran underground gay bars and created vital spaces for the Black queer community in the late 20th century London. There's a great article on this in the Paddock document published by Galdem. So this concept of intersectionality is very broad and diverse, and we will never get through all of it in one event, but there are some things you can look up for yourself as well. The next speaker is the second of the featured acts. Tasnim Hassan is a PhD student at Durham University, conducting research on the intersections between race and disability. Like me, she is also a former sabbatical officer from a student union background. And I know she does some work with Dr. Adebayo at Ladders for Action as well. So I'll let Tasnim introduce herself more extensively. Simply, I had to ask her to speak today because after one meeting, I was simply in awe of all she does and her activism, and she's doing really important research on the intersectionality with race and disability, which I think needs to be more done, especially in a UK context as well. So much disability research is America-centric, and Britain is a very different cultural landscape to the United States. Tasnim, are you ready?
Yes, would you mind? Can I share the screen?
I will make you host.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. This is also not a poem. And like Jen, I've also got a presentation, but it's mostly full of doodles. Also, I'm incredibly blown away with everything that I've heard tonight. Absolutely loving it. I don't come across, I'm not exposed with lots of poetry and things like that. So I have really, really enjoyed tonight. So thank you for letting me be a part of it. Sharing my screen, can you see it? I'm presuming you can see it. Cool. So, yeah, so yes, so my name is Tasnim. I'm a PhD student at Durham University, and I am in the Department of Sociology. And the next slide will be more or less me talking about myself for a while. But again, thank you ever so much for letting me be a part of this. Intersectionality was something that I came across back in 2015. So about 7 years ago, when I first got involved in disability justice, activism and things like that. So it was really incredible being able to be part of this platform, to be able to talk about my insight of it, and I guess being able to talk about it in the context of disability, because quite often when we're talking about equality and things like that, disability is largely ignored or erased or forgotten in this sort of conversation. What I will be doing is kind of talking about intersectionality more in a practical sense. So I'll talk a little bit about, who I am and what my influences are and how it's made me reflect a lot on who I am and my positionality. So it's something that you've heard a lot about tonight. Then I'll talk a little bit about the ways in which this is kind of shaped, what is my research actually about, how it shapes some of the decisions that I've made in the research and things like that. And then towards the and then I'll kind of talk about some of the findings that I've got, because I'm still kind of in my final data collection stage. So there's still a little bit more to go. But I hope as we go through this, you'll see the value that intersectionality has had in my, my perspective and how I've basically developed as a person and as a researcher. So I guess the very first part is kind of who, or who I am, who am I, and kind of sort of where my knowledge comes from, because that largely shapes how we perceive the world and where we get our knowledge from. So a great deal of it has been, a massive sense of introspection, and really rethink about, where I grew up, the sort of environments that we were talking about. I know, Trey, you mentioned earlier, you grew up in a heavy, a white-dominated area. It's also the same situation for me, and a lot of that meant that discussions of race and things like that weren't really talked about very much. I'm incredibly, in the past few years, we've had more conversations about race. And this has helped me be able to rethink about what spaces I have and haven't been in, and where do I get my knowledge from. But then also when we take a little bit of a closer look, we look at things like disability studies, and that's where I got a lot of my knowledge growing up. But a lot of the scholars behind disability studies are white. A lot of the kind of material and the theories that are white. So they don't 100%, we're getting better. No, we're not. I think there's still a lot more work to do. But being able to kind of think about disability from all sorts of perspectives is something that, that we still haven't largely done. And then there's this idea of labels. So I'm British or second gen British Bangladeshi, and I'm a disabled person, and so I'm very much an insider to my research. My journey of how I've navigated my disability was, one major part as to why I'm doing the research that I am today, which is incredibly exciting. But there's been a lot when it just comes to labels itself. So we were saying earlier that disabled, being able to call yourself disabled might not necessarily be something that people want to do. And I know my experience since growing up, it wasn't something that I wanted anything to do with. I found myself managing or essentially struggling in silence a lot, but I was still able to get by and do things. But I found that I had to put 10 times the effort just being able to take part in things. But likewise, as I've gone older, I have both a visual and hearing impairment, and I'm growing closer and closer to this idea of calling myself deaf blind as well. And what we can see is that with language and things like that, it's been a personal journey, and it will be for many others too. But things like that and my experience and my journey through that has made me really think about what terminologies we use and how essentially what categories are there, because a lot of these categories have been made by other people, predominantly white people, and their agenda and their need to other us as well. So a big part of how I came to this area of this research was I was disabled students officer in my old work where I was doing my undergrad for 2 years, and through it, and then I was also elected to also be a sabbatical officer, like Cho had mentioned. And it was through, in those sort of situations, I had the privilege of being able to attend some of the events and conferences led by the National Union of Students. And within these sort of conferences, they had like intersectional caucuses. So they had caucuses for Black disabled people. They had caucuses for, so if this was a disabled conference, Black disabled people, disabled women, LGBT plus disabled people. And for me, that was kind of essentially the first time and place where I met diverse disabled people, let alone Black and brown disabled people. And it was from those sort of conversations where we recognized that, in a lot of ways that our experiences are similar, a lot of ways that we have the same level of understanding. Even if we didn't go through it ourselves, we understood what it meant to go through that experience. We understood the pressures that we were facing through. It was that kind of sort of level of compassion, which was something that I didn't get for majority of my life until I was about 20, more or less. But recognizing that, it helped me recognize that my experience was very unique as a disabled person of color, and that if I were to do research like this, that there needed to be an element of collaborative working, or there needed to be an element of making sure that other voices were meaningfully involved in these sort of things, because too often research is kind of done, but never really recognizing the value of what people have to say, to involve them in what they have to say, because I guess that's why, a lot of research has the tendency to be very much, we're looking at like the sort of power dynamics. As someone who's an academic, you're seen as someone who's able to kind of essentially say, define a little bit more about this later, but define whose voices actually matter and who doesn't. But I guess my experience of having been in these sort of spaces, it made me recognize that there were a lot of things that we didn't realize, and you can't just kind of basically box, our experiences into one. And then the last little bit is my activism is something very much that I continue to do with. So I'm also involved, one of the co-chairs of the Disabled Black Lives Matter group at the Alliance for Further Inclusive Education, which is a charity. And later this year, I'm going to be working with Black Thrive, where I get to carry on my work with disability and race. So it's something that I've been incredibly passionate about. It's something that where I know where, you know, I don't necessarily belong to certain communities as much, because we need to be able to respect, you know, our differences as too. It's always the sort of thing that I was taking on myself to make sure that I can be, you know, essentially kind of be an ally or be able to be a support and amplify the voices that need to be heard. So then we go into my research, and my research in a nutshell has 2 stages. So this is what I mean by thinking about things more in a practical way. But you'll see, like, as a sociologist, you're almost given you almost kind of basically have to wrestle with a lot of questions on a regular basis, and you'll see a lot of these sort of challenges and a lot of the things I've had to consider. So the first stage of my research was involving, like, you know, interviews, and these were pretty much very detailed interviews, and I'll go into a little bit more about what the purpose was and things like that. But whatever came out of these interviews, they were then going to be form the basis of the survey. So the survey is about to come out very, very soon. So hopefully if you follow me on things like Twitter and things like that, you'll see more about it as well. And it'd be great to help share the word about this, because it's almost like my entire 5 years life of work has gone into the survey, where, you know, it's capturing a lot of those experiences of what it means to be a disabled person of color, more specifically in this case, what it means to be a Black and brown disabled person. But we'll go a little bit back. When I was going about doing these sort of interviews, there's actually initially, I also did a lot of this sort of field work and these sort of interviews at the peak of when, you know, the lockdowns were happening and a lot of the lockdown measures were happening as well. So I had that kind of going for me as well. Nonetheless, I went about doing these sort of interviews, and these sort of interviews were interesting because they weren't sort of real standard interviews, in that you had sort of fixed questions and people needed to answer these sort of things. Because naturally, when you have fixed questions, you almost inherently have like some sort of biases behind the sort of questions. Because as someone who's kind of been involved in the community, it didn't feel right for me to basically make assumptions about what we go through, because I can't speak for everyone. And by having these sort of as unstructured and very loose sort of structure to it, it basically had any, you know, members of the community to kind of talk about what mattered to them in terms of how they navigate things like disability and race, what came more to their mind and things like that. And it's been really, really powerful in that sense, because, you know, prior to doing these sort of interviews, I had a lot of ideas, a lot of suspicions about what I think in theory could come up. But again, a lot of that was kind of guided by white disability studies. So an example that I can give is that there was a big focus in sort of the literature that exists that talks a lot about how, you know, the focus for disabled people is, you know, a lot on autonomy and independence and things like that. And interestingly enough, you know, these things did sort of come up and come and go within these sort of interviews, but they weren't the sole focus, they weren't the prime focus. And that's really interesting, because we kind of have to question what are Western notions about how people should be living their lives and what are not. And basically just like how this has this idea of what, you know, disabled people should in theory be doing. But again, it raises a question as to the sort of things that we kind of come across on a daily basis. The other thing is I did a pre-screening questionnaire beforehand. And the idea behind this sort of questionnaire was to make sure that a range of people who come from a range of like racial and ethnic backgrounds were involved, as well as people who had a range of disabilities. And we can appreciate that, you know, that's going to be a lot of different types of people and it coming from lots of different backgrounds, and that's going to be a lot of intersection. But in this process, it's been really, really helpful, because it's made me think about, when I put research out there, what label do I put out there? Because, for example, because you want to be able to reach the people who you want to basically, who this research is about. Do you use words like they? Do you use me? Do you use words like people of color? And again, behind each of those words and meanings, you know, it's important to understand the broader context of it and things like that as well. But at the same time, the same goes for disability, where there are a lot of people who prefer identity first language, such as I am a disabled person, or there are other people who prefer a person who has a disability because they would rather see the person first. So the thing is, there's a lot of nuances there that make you think about when you put a piece of work out there, how do you do it justice? How do you allow it to connect to the people that you really want it to reach? And again, this goes on to, you know, extend over to like the sort of range of people that we want to involve in our research. How do we cover a lot of the people that we want to include in our studies? Because it's not easy to basically cover all bases. A bit of that was also kind of addressed by targeting and trying to find certain like demographics, if you will. And a lot of that was also guided by sort of like existing literature that sort of exists out there, because there are quite a few things that do exist that help you guide, you know, the sort of demographics that should be involved and things like that. But the question that constantly comes up is whose voice is involved in this research? And I felt like I had a lot of responsibility, and I almost felt like a gatekeeper, because it was saying that whoever's voices were involved in this project so far, their voices matter. But then you have to think about how their access to, for example, the internet is how they got to be able to see the resources that have been shown online, and not everyone's going to have that. So there's a lot of factors to always kind of bear in mind when it comes to approaching sort of the researchers, when it comes to thinking about language and things like that. But the other thing that I've also thought is I have to think about who I am. And, you know, I'm someone who's British South Asian, and naturally, you know, that will may gravitate, people who may be interested may gravitate also from, you know, South Asian backgrounds and things like that. So that was also something that I was incredibly conscious of. Also, being a woman in this process is another thing as well, because maybe people would find that they're more comfortable talking to another woman if that's how. If that's what they preferred and things like that. So there are those sort of things that you have to think about, because sometimes the knowledge that we're given isn't so clear cut, and it's important that when you do this sort of stuff, do this sort of research, that you are transparent, you are conscious where there are gaps, you are conscious to make an effort, you're conscious to reflect the way that you put your material out there, you recognize how you and who you are and how you come across to people also going to shape that. But yeah, moving on, we go into like how the interviews affect the survey. And it's been really interesting. It's actually been incredibly challenging being able to go through all those interviews and being able to find like certain themes that came across that were really important to delve into. But what I love about this survey, when it does go out, hopefully in the next 2 weeks or so, is that it's going to allow me to be able to ask these sort of questions, ask these sort of experiences and perspective to even more, you know, Black and brown disabled people. It's going to be because I don't think this field has so much. It has like a lot of stats behind it, and we know that when you have data and stats and facts behind these sort of things, it helps strengthen the case from being able to like advocate change and being able to challenge the systems that we're working in. The other part of this research as well, when I was talking a little bit about collaborative working, although you know, pandemic was massively affected the way that I could do this as much as I would have liked, and there's obviously like some sort of like time and funding constraints. A part of what I try to do throughout this whole research is involving you know, community members. They've more or less essentially guided what was going to go onto the survey. They more or less kind of determined what sort of themes are going to come up. They've also been involved, and they are currently being involved in the process of being able to reflect on the survey design that I've created and things like that, so that their input and their knowledge and their insight is involved throughout the process. And then in the whole process of building these sort of surveys and kind of deciding what those sort of themes are, a big part I had to think about, and I will be thinking the more I kind of carry on looking at, sort of the findings, is the narrative that we're kind of building. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to be boxing people into one group. I think that's the problem that we're trying to stay away from, because we don't want to basically, homogenize and say that everybody's experience is just, X and Y, and that is it. And we want to be able to recognize these intersectional nuances as well as we can, and be able to do it justice and recognize those differences. Otherwise, we'll end up doing harm. And an example that I wanted to give about what I mean that a narrative can do harm, because this is something that I've had to think about a lot. So I use the so for example, a lot of people who are involved in my project, they could talk a lot about, for example, how the parents didn't necessarily support them in the process of figuring out their disability, or that they didn't know about the support that was available. But we recognize that sort of narrative, if we only focus on that dimension of it, it ends up putting the blame on Black and brown communities rather than acknowledging that there's these sort of institutional barriers for it. So, for example, in my experience growing up, my disability, I would say, was probably diagnosed a lot later than it could have been. It could have been picked up a lot earlier. But I could imagine my parents going to the doctor, parents who have accents, parents who have come from Bangladesh and things like that, not being taken seriously by doctors, not being believed, not being heard, and things like that. And the sort of the materials and resources that we have, how readily are they available nowadays to all kinds of communities out there? But there's an importance to recognize sort of the personal struggles that we have within our community, but as well as being able to recognize sort of the institutional, the systemic wider issues. And another example I want to give is we've seen through the pandemic with COVID and the vaccine, there wasn't such a high intake of the vaccine from the community, but we saw the narrative shift a lot on blaming them and blaming their values and blaming their religious beliefs, etc., etc. But what it failed to do is kind of recognize that there's a huge history of medical mistreatment, and that was not something that was very much told in the narrative of when we're looking at Black and brown disabled people's experiences. So I guess when it comes to when it comes to me analyzing all of this sort of stuff, whatever the narrative is, that we need to be able to bring all parts to it. We need to be able to kind of challenge the sort of systems that come out there as well. Before I go on to my sort of conclusions, because I've got basically half my findings kind of concrete and the other half not so much, but I'm hoping next year I'll be able to share them a lot more easily, is that there's sort of 4 themes that have come up. And the 4 themes are, the first one is to do with you having the right information so these are all things that are featured in the survey. So the first one is about you having the right information at the right time by the right people. And a lot of that is recognizing that, for example, getting a diagnosis is a privilege in itself. Being heard and being listened to is a privilege in itself. Recognizing that, being able to know what your disability means for you and how it's going to impact you is something. Are there resources out there? The next one kind of talks about, navigating support. How do we know what support is even available out there, and what are our experiences getting support, but also what are our experiences when we want to challenge support when it's not given at all or given really poorly, because there's, I think I can highly suspect that a lot of our experiences of being able to challenge these sort of things, you're dealing with kind of the racial elements of it too, being able to challenge people, otherwise you're seen as much more difficult or aggressive. And then the third theme in this is this idea of, attitudes and perceptions towards disability. So you as a disabled person, how do you view yourself as a disabled person, and how do other people treat you because you have a disability, and what does that mean for things like expectations and what people think about your potential and things like that. And the final one is more about belonging and acceptance. How how are all parts of you accepted? Have you, do you feel like you belong to the people that you see on a regular basis, the people that we see as like role models, the people that we work with, the people that we're surrounded with? Is there that feeling of exclusion and inclusion? There's obviously a lot of the answers that, a lot of us can already suspect what sort of answers will be, but it was going to be really, really interesting being able to put together research, being able to put together all of this sort of information so that it can be used by members of this community to challenge the systems that are in place. So the way to conclude, the way in which intersectionality has played a massive part in the way that I've approached my research and the sort of thing and how I kind of perceive it and my approach to it, it's made me massively introspective of the kind of person who I am. I'm constantly always kind of figuring, I recognize a lot better than I did a few years ago, the privilege that I have, the way, for example, that my disability is largely quite hidden, the way that I when we're talking about race, how does this fit into the broader race equality movement? When we're looking at Black and brown people, how does it fit within the South Asian community in itself as well? So it's really interesting because a lot of these sort of questions I haven't always figured out myself, but it does make you think a lot, which we can all relate to. A lot of it in terms of what I don't know and I can't speak for other people's experiences is very much delving into, continued learning, being able to read other people's like their work, their knowledge, and or where there are gaps, especially being able to look to what exists out there. Because again, you have to recognize that, a research like mine is not going to be able to cover all bases, but as long as there's a continued journey of learning about other people's histories and journeys as well, that's also a big part of intersectionality and recognizing that. And then we're talking about labels and deconstructing the sort of things that we get told are such a norm in today's society. The labels that we use is something that that's like been a massive part of this research, the way in which that there's so many dimensions to consider, and that and how they kind of crisscross with each other on what it means and how it shapes our experiences is another thing. And I guess a big part, if you've seen, is that with the role of my research and what I want to do, I want to be able to use it in a social justice way to be able to challenge the sort of systems that we have in place and be able to kind of challenge and be able to advocate and amplify the voices of Black disabled and Black and brown disabled people. So I guess that for me is what intersectionality has added to me. It's been a concept that I've been so familiar with for the longest of time, but I feel like I've loved my sort of academic journey because you learn to always, I feel like the more you learn, the less you actually know, because there's always so much to learn. And I'm incredibly privileged to have gotten to where I am, but I want to be able to use this knowledge, use my experiences, use my activism to be able to support the community that I very much belong to. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Tasnim. And I definitely agree there about the more you learn, the less you know. In terms of my own work, it's like in the historical stuff that I do, and that Black history is a whole minefield. And I'm just focused on Black history within Britain, like British history. But then when you start seeing how much British history happened outside of Britain, then you start thinking, oh, you don't actually know that much after all. And I think that whole ethos should be taken into academia as well, especially when it comes to lecturers and students and how students can teach their lecturers things and not just the other way around. Because I did find as a student that there were numbers of academics that thought they were like the beacon of all knowledge, essentially. And then when a student does know things, they act really surprised, essentially. Yeah, thanks for that, Tasnim. And I admit that I've had personal investment here, as race and disability is important, a part of my own life and how society treats me as a Black person and as a disabled person. It's something that's got to me to the point where I actually wrote a dissertation length essay about autism within the Black community from my own perspective, which is in the document, Padlet document, for a website called Neuroclastic. It's a US website, but you'll find a lot of writers on there who speak from their own perspectives of being autistic. Some of them are Black and brown, some of them are white, but there's also stuff around there around sexuality and gender and the intersections with gender, sexuality and autism too. So on that note, I would like to invite Nabeela Ahamed to the stage, please, or the virtual stage. Nabeela is a writer, storyteller, and multilingual poet and spoken word artist. She had poems published in England, America, Pakistan, and India. She self-published her book, Despite Our Differences, which is also linked in the Padlet document as well, and is currently working on her novel. So give a round of applause for Nabeela.
Really enjoyed it. It's one of those evenings where you're quite happy just to sit and listen without saying a word. So
Nabeela, we can't hear you properly.
Bear with me. You can hear that? Sorry.
Nabeela, we can't hear you. Hang on a minute. Hello?
My laptop's gone funny very recently, and I keep forgetting that I can hear people clearly, but they can't hear me.
Oh yeah, that's better.
Sorry. This first poem is called Isms, and it covers quite a few of my experiences. I persisted. I had experienced racism. By the time I was 3. I knew what it looked like, a huge balloon that enveloped me. I was paralyzed with fear. There was no windows. So no one could see and rescue me. There was no door that I could hope to run for. When I closed my eyes, it didn't go away. It was I was 9 when I learned about casteism. I was on the other side this time. I was protected by privilege. Not because of the kind of soul I was, but the clan I had taken birth into. I'm a Rajput. We only marry at our own level. The Jatmochi, Derzi, Kamar, Masalli are all tradespeople, the Gammi. Their attitude and values were like the jobs, left something to be desired. Well, that's what I was told. We were landowners, food providers, live with dignity, respect, and authority. I understand white privilege, where all doors were open to me. They were shut to all the castes below me. I understood sexism before I was 10. There was a long list of things girls did not do, and an even longer one of what they did do. I didn't like most things on either list. But I'd learned to be a good little girl a long time ago, squashing my vocal cords, holding back. So they would appease the listener. I knew how to please before I knew who I was. I made a secret pact with myself and shared it with no one. I would appease my way out of patriarchy by holding degrees like swords. To cut my way through, I have 3 so far. I might need another. Misogyny and bullying don't have isms. Maybe they should. I learned how they felt in a boardroom. When the assistant chief executive couldn't get me to collude or obey, he suggested how little he would pay to have sex with me had I been for sale. I remember my scalp getting hot, my head taking a spin, my heart beating to get out. but I was trained to squash, to suppress. He didn't get any satisfaction. He didn't get any punishment either. I've always known classism. It is the postcode you occupy, the quality of schools you can attend, the queues at your doctors and hospitals, the jobs your parents hold, the careers your teachers suggest, the after-school clubs you can choose. It is your accent, how you stand, how you look into someone's eye with entitlement or with apology. I'm tired of negativisms. I'm going to make a new one, just for me and just for you. It's called loveism. Loveism is when my white teacher stood up against all the SLT so I could skip a year because she believed in me. I proved her right. It was the very least I could do. Loveism is when my mum is flabbergasted at the tales of mistreatment of a lower caste, when she sits with them, eats with them, shares the same plate, asks for advice, when they call her princess and she calls them Queen Mother. And most importantly, when she gives us the look, only God is superior. The most prized attribute is humility. Loveism is when my male cousins, brought up in and surrounded by patriarchy, take another unwanted, unopened love letter from me, written by yet another boy who knows it is just an easy chance for him, and any tag of deviant behavior will only be attached to me. No price for them to pay. My education would be stopped in an instant. They took the letters, looked at me with smiling eyes, patted my head affectionately. You carry on with your studies. We'll deal with this. So loveism is when my uncle slapped a boy whose family he had spotted all his life for threatening me to meet him or else. He never harassed me again. Loveism is having friends from all backgrounds, ages, colours, races, religions, and none. Sexualities and still deciding, castes, clans, sharing lunches at each other's houses, walking on all textures of earth, sipping tea, eating cake, exploring new places, having adventures, discussing and debating everything. Nothing censored, nothing left out. Fears, worries, new ideas, picked apart, put back together with greater wisdom, without being conscious of, and completely forgetting about isms. Thank you. That was my first poem, Isms. The second one I'm going to share with you takes you to slightly darker places. It's about wars. For some reason, humans love wars. They haven't stopped, and I don't think they're going to stop in our lifetime. It's called, this poem is called It of Conditions. They said you will never be able to digest happiness. They said everything you endure for too long becomes a condition, and mine was misery. They weren't wrong. I had lost my mother when the Mongols came and burnt her alive. Conquering has always been important, you see. I lost my giant father to the Holy Crusades, trying to push back those barbaric Muslims, saving our civilization and pious lands. Don't ask what happens to families with no men. I saw my handsome uncle, all bones and naked, finally gassed in the Holocaust, with no one he knew but all he loved. His eyes had more questions than answers. My aunt was raped by more than I could count, breast chopped off. Someone's revenge in the partition. The same happened to my friend's sister, opposite sides revenge. Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, all women, weapons of war. My grandma's wails still pierce my ears. After seeing son after son, grandson after grandson tortured and then slaughtered. I was in Bosnia, you see, wrong creed again. In Congo, my daughter screamed. I begged and placed my head on his shoes. He didn't care. He put the pistol inside her and shot. I wish she had died. On a sunny summer's day, after still being alive, they did my assessment. They said, your condition is misery. You cannot digest joy. I closed my eyes, orange suns and purple skies. I remembered all the smiles, the laughs, the dance, the songs, the paintings, the art, and oh, the smell of those delicious cuisine. The sweet hands, the arched necks, the curled mustaches, the full lips, the snake hips, the fast moves, the loud music, the melodies of their souls, hearts full of hope, eyes overflowing with dreams. And I swore I will live for each one of them, lost in any war by any religion, any country, any culture, in any history. I will live. I will live, smile, laugh, sing, dance, read, write, and write again. I will defy your conditions, and I will defy my conditions. I will live and I will love with more passion than you have to destroy me. I will live and I will love as each and every one of them deserve to live and deserve to love. The last poem I'm going to share with you is called Minority, because somewhere we are all a minority. I suppose it says, I'm a minority, I'm vulnerable, look out for me. I'm a Muslim in the West. Each time one belonging to my faith of 1.8 billion is part of a terror attack, I'm viewed with suspicion and hatred. I am to answer questions I do not know the answers to. I'm a minority, I'm vulnerable, look out for me. I'm a Hindu in Pakistan. Each time an extremist Hindu kills a Muslim for eating beef across the border, each time Kashmiris are tortured by India, I'm viewed with suspicion and hatred. I have to answer questions I do not know the answers to. I'm a minority, I'm vulnerable, look out for me. I belong to a religion and I'm Chinese. I'm sent to correction facilities for having faith, tortured and abused to relinquish my beliefs. Mass-produced item of Chinese quality. If you're a majority, you are lucky. You and your loved ones are safe. I'm a minority. Look out for me. I'm scared and an easy target. Protect me. And the last one I'm going to share is called, Please Don't Be Afraid of Me. Please don't be afraid of me. I know I am Black and it's very early, but I'm a soldier on holiday. I can't afford to let my fitness go. I wake up before my family. So come for my jog before sunrise. Please don't be afraid of me. I know I don't live in a desert and I don't need to wear a long loose dress and a cap on my head, but they say that's how the Prophet and his companions dress, and it helps me feel close to them. Please don't be afraid of me. I know I'm 6 foot tall and built like a truck. I know my head is shaven and my body is full of tattoos. I work school hours so I can be home for my kids and care for my wife after the carer leaves. Please don't be afraid of me. I wear a turban and my gara. My beard is long and I know who I resemble. But once I finish teaching, I head straight for the langar. Contributing to society is not what I preach, but what I practice. Please don't be afraid of me. I know I'm Chinese heritage. But my mum never managed to afford the ticket to take us back home. I give tuition after school to help her out. I know as much as you do about Wuhan. Please don't be afraid of me. Thank you very much, Trey.
Thanks very much, Nabeela, for sharing. And I think all of us in here can probably relate to parts of that as well. I think listening to you speak there, it further reminds me about the importance of, again, like religion and faith in specifically anti-racism work, and how the numbers of like hate crimes and race incidents are also intersecting with religion, specifically like Islamophobia I'm thinking of here. And I want to highlight, so there's a academic called Sophia Ackle, who is the race equality lead at London Metropolitan University, who did a study into Islamophobia on university campuses, and it's called Institutionalized, the rise of Islamophobia in higher education. And it was quite extensive and also includes things around dehomogenizing Muslimness, I guess the term would be, around staff and students. And it works that through an intersectional framing, and that's at London Metropolitan, and that I linked it in the Padlet document, and I'll copy it again soon. The study goes to great lengths to articulate the diversity within the experiences of Muslim students and staff on campus, which I think should be a standard for talking about all groups of people, and that no group is homogenous, and people even within that group will disagree with each other. It is that document is 55 pages. So I would recommend looking at it when anyone's view's got time. Many of you will know Dr. Muna Abdi as well, who's quite vocal about this sort of thing on Twitter and elsewhere. And I would recommend everyone follow her, but she does speak about the intersections between Muslimness and Blackness, and also employment, where if you're both within these things, you are twice as likely to be unemployed. And if you're a woman, more so as well. Her book, Somali Students' School Experiences, Masculinity, Race and Identity, is being released in September this year. And I'm sure will add another intersectional experience to Somali boys within the school system. So if you're on Twitter and you're not following Muna Abdi, I'll definitely recommend following her and her work. I found her insights really useful. And I even cited her tweets in my master's thesis last year as well on education. And on the topic of books, I would like to invite Geraldine Moyo to the stage. Is Geraldine here now? Yeah. Geraldine?
Yes, just a second, sorry.
Awesome.
Putting my camera on. Hi, good evening, everybody. I hope you can see me now. Oh, you can't see me. Can you see me now?
Yeah.
Oh,
So hi. So Geraldine is a first-time author with her book, My Africa, that introduces children to the African continent in a fun, educational and interactive manner. Geraldine is also a social worker, and I would like to invite Geraldine to the stage and probably talk more about her book and herself and so on. So thanks, Geraldine, for joining us.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Trey, for this forum. It is so insightful, and I just can't say enough about how much I've learned, and just the insightfulness and expressions of the poems today. My experience of being born in Zimbabwe and raised there until I was about 7 years old, and then moved to Denmark, affected me in so many ways, so many positives and so many challenging experiences, as you can imagine. However, it was really when I had my two boys in 2013, my first son was born, I realized that some of the experiences that I'd gone through in Denmark and how I'd managed to cope through some of those difficulties was really because I had had an experience of being born and raised in Zimbabwe, and that had cemented my experience and my identity. And irrespective of what I went through, I was able to always anchor back to my childhood in Zimbabwe. And as a little girl, and I had that Kunta Kinte experience, I think, where you're sort of from the roots, where you realize that there's a big ocean in front of you, and actually you are not going back. And actually your children, this is their home, this is their country, this is where they will grow up. And I realized that I wanted to give them a taste of Africa, a taste of what I had experienced. And at the time there was Ebola, so yes, we could have traveled to their home country, Nigeria, and to Zimbabwe as well, but there were so many things going on in the world. Apologies, I'm really hot. So I wrote a little children's book, which I wanted to use as a reference to conversations, not just for my children, but also the children that they were around, where we were living at the time in Oxford. There were other children. As soon as children could articulate speech, they asked about color, and they did it so innocently that I thought to myself, actually, I want their first experiences of race, identity, other cultures to be a really positive one. And I want there to be an open conversation about it. I don't want the conversation to start off from secondary school, primary school, racism. So I wrote my little book, and I've written My Africa, and I've also written My Europe subsequently as well. So I will read My Africa, and then, yeah. So, in a place far away, where you use a boat or a plane to get there, is the big continent of Africa, with many countries such as Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Kenya. Can you think of another African country? While hyenas and cheetahs play in the glare of the sun, ostriches, wildebeests, zebras walk around the savannah looking for some leaves and grass. Can you find your favorite African animal? In Africa, there are different kinds of lovely foods such as sweet plantains, nutty domoda, and yummy puff puffs. What African foods have you tried? Some of the foods are tastier to eat using your hands, such as injera made with the ancient grain turf, amachagata made from kernels of maize, gari made from bittersweet root called cassava. Can you think of a food you would love to eat with your hands? Timbuktu was built by the Tuareg. South Africans sing and dance artistically. Ghanaians make beautiful printed patterns. Ivorians are skillful at kicking the ball. The Senegalese play the djembe with great might. Can you think of other things Africans are good at? Many Africans who live in continents such as Europe and the Americas came on a boat or a plane from faraway Africa. Some Africans are a beautiful black color, some are beautiful yellow, some are beautiful white, some are beautiful brown. Whatever their color, they celebrate the amazing continent of Africa where they came from. So thank you so much for listening to this. This is really just a book to open the conversation with children about their race, their identity, and the amazing continent of Africa, where we came from and where we now are. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Geraldine. So I think on that point with intersectionality, then it's important to see that intersectionality is global and it affects everybody as a personal experience, but also the more as a global system under patriarchy and white supremacy and so on, and how we see the world. Particularly when I think about Africa and my introduction to it, many of my African colleagues who are immigrants into the UK tell me that they didn't really talk about themselves as Black until they entered Europe, and that really put it into perspective for me, and how for me growing up in Europe, I've really only identified myself as Black because of the ideas that Europe puts upon you as an individual, but then people who've grown up on the African continent told me that they didn't see themselves as that until they experienced racism in European countries like Britain and France and places like that. And similarly, for people that I know who are immigrants from other parts of the world, say India, for example, into Britain, the sorts of discrimination that they've experienced in Britain, they don't understand it in relation to their own country. Which I found really interesting because they came here as adults, so they've had that whole lives not experiencing the sorts of racism that many of us who were born in Britain or America or so on have come used to. Quite unfortunately, I used to it. So on that note, I want to invite the last act this evening to the stage, and is Sadia ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Awesome. I don't own Sadia at all. She contacted me after I did a call out for poets, or I think it was on Instagram, and she just sounded like a really interesting person. So I wanted to get her to speak tonight. Sadia Mir describes herself as a young woman using her learned experience to help those who struggle to merge both her ethnic and national identities through mental health, culturally informed practices, and youth participation in previously alienated areas, heritage, health, and non-classroom teaching. Her poetry and spoken word focuses on life as a young Muslim woman in a Western country. So Sadia, take it away.
Thank you very much much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for putting the advert out. This has just been a wonderful, wonderful event. I won't keep you all too long. I know it's a really hot day, so I'll only be doing 2 pieces. And hopefully we can have a little bit of laugh with one of them. So the first poem that I would like to share is titled Love Letters from My Doctor. So I suffer with premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which it just means that 2 weeks before my period, I get a whole range of symptoms, be they physical or mental. And it has been quite a tiring journey kind of to get the diagnosis and to get people to believe me. So these are a few of the things I have experienced, and it's from the perspective of my doctor. Love notes from my doctor. You're 11 years old and in so much pain that you can't stand. Congratulations, you're a woman. Sorry, you can't handle it? Just go get pregnant. Auntie, just go get her pregnant. You're 15 years old and in so much pain you vomit daily. Congratulations, you're a woman. Sorry, you can't handle it? What do you want me to do about it? Auntie, why did you bring her in here? You're 18 years old and in so much pain you can't see the light in life anymore. Congratulations, you're a woman. Sorry, you can't handle it? It's all in your head, Auntie, it's all in her head. You're 21 years old and you're in so much pain you can't eat. Congratulations, you're a woman. Sorry, you can't handle it? Here, take this magic pill. Don't worry, Auntie, it's just a pill for sleeping. Oh, you're 21, screaming how you don't want to live. Congratulations, you're on antidepressants. Sorry, you can't handle it. But it was only the lowest stage, Auntie. You didn't hear me say that it was just for sleeping. You're 21, taking 6 months to learn how to live again. Congratulations, you're a woman. Sorry, you couldn't handle it? You should have gotten pregnant then. Auntie, I can still help. You're 25 and I haven't heard from you for a while. Congratulations, you're a woman. Sorry, did you handle it? No, come back. I haven't made enough money from you. Auntie, bring her back. You're 25 and not answering my letters. Congratulations, you're going to die without me. Sorry, I can't handle it. Don't tell anyone. Auntie, don't tell anyone what I said to her. And my second piece is I'm not like them. Growing up, I lived in a predominantly white area. So in high school, essentially, I thought I was white. And then my college was in a very, very brown Muslim area. And again, I was like, oh my goodness, what is going on? Now I had to fit in again. So this is kind of my journey figuring out who I am as a person. It's called I'm Not Like Them. I'm not like them. It's so funny and I'm so happy. I love my hair and my natural beauty and I only speak English, so I'm not like them. I'm one of you. My skin isn't that dark. Look, I fit in. It's so funny and I'm so happy. I'm not like them. Why are you leaving me? I promise I'm like you. I'll beg my parents to let me do the same as you. It's not funny. I'm not happy. I'm not like them. Accept me back. I'm you. I'm white and normal and beautiful and perfect. I'm not like them. I'm all alone. There's no white people in this college, but I'm not like these brown people. I'm not like them and it hurts. Where do I stand? Where do I go? I'm not like them, but I want to. Whether it's the left or the right, where do I go? I'm not like them. I've lost them from both sides. I'm not like them or them or them. I'm me, and I don't know what that means. I'm not like them, and I guess I'm not like me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was really thought-provoking and excellent.
Thank you.
And I think particularly the first poem has sort of resonance in terms of Obsidian's poem as well, about abortion, and then sort of tying both into the sort of state-sanctioned violence in terms of Roe v. Wade too. And how that sort of stuff could happen in a UK context. And in Northern Ireland in particular, they decriminalised those laws, but then at the same time, the implementation of it has not been enactioned, essentially. So on one side of it, you can have laws that protect people, but then at the same time, if they're not being actioned by people that are being elected to do so, then that's when sort of the violence comes in through neglect and inaction and so on. So that was our last act. I'm just going to do my outro now to basically cover everything that's been talked about today. So for us in Britain, Roe v. Wade could happen with numbers of the Tories. Tories ideologically being on the same wavelength as Trump and many of people who are like Trump pushing through that sort of legislation. They've already gone after immigrants and asylum seekers. With the COVID-19 pandemic and the choices made, they also went after the disabled, still going after them through the choices that's been made. The police storming the Sarah Everard vigil as well show particularly that cis white women, things that have long happened to Black and brown women could also happen to them at the same time. In October 2019, Northern Ireland decriminalised abortion, but access to abortion is still precarious and abortion services still have not been commissioned. Anti-abortion laws could be in the next phase of Britain as the government moves further and further right. And that would fit well within the state's anti-trans obsession, which is also backed up by state-owned media as well. So the fact intersectionality began in the US under US legal studies and Black feminism is important, as the late Black Panther leader Fred Hampton said that theory is cool, but theory without practice ain't shit. So feminist theorizing continues to show relevance in how state violence affects everybody. Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, Kimberlé Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, Alice Walker, and the numbers of others who have contributed to this work. With the government continuing to usher in laws to stop us advocating for ourselves out of fear of imprisonment under protest laws as well. It reminds me how critical race theory is one of the ways we can make sense of our present and our own personal experiences into a wider social and political context. The Nationality and Borders Bill, which is now the Borders Act, for example, how would this impact migrant women who are victims of domestic violence and domestic abuse? What about Black and brown, gay or trans students, for example, that come from countries where it's not safe for them to be out? What if these students end up being deported back to countries where being gay, for example, is a capital offence? With the Crime, Policing and Sentencing Bill, so the Courts Act, this may be of interest in terms of running it through a critical race lens. People who fall under that category that we call white has moved and changed that history. That legislation basically criminalises Gypsy, Roma traveller people. The victims of these pieces of legislation will also be likely to be on a multiple axis of oppression. UK immigration policy has always tried to keep Black and brown people out and white people in, but who's been defined as white has changed across time and history as well. So I think that's something we all ought to remember. And stop and search, which has long impacted Black people disproportionately as well. But it's not all lost, as long as there is community and people striving in our communities to organise and mobilise. I think there is some hope in that. And I use the term community in terms of the local communities, but also global ones and international ones, and sort of those transatlantic global relationships that people have. And the pandemic has sort of opened that up a bit more, with people going online and through Zoom and things like that. If climate activists are working with Black Lives Matter while also doing things with the Vogue sector, so violence against women and girls, while also doing things with LGBTQ rights and so on, and people seeing that each movement is valid and sort of intersectional, there's always hope in that. So I end the session by saying there will be no feminism for white women. without the toil and the struggle of their Black and brown colleagues. As Mickey Kendall stated in Hood Feminism, all too often the focus of mainstream white feminism is not on the basic survival of the many, but on increasing privilege for the few. So contemporary conversations on intersectionality build on a longer history of ideas, debates, and concepts that Black and brown thinkers and revolutionaries created for us to follow. There's strength in that, and I sort of beg everyone, myself included, to always remember that as well. So Black and brown women did a lot of the legwork for feminism, but then it was hijacked by white women, and then the movement became white. And I think that's often missed when discussing these things. When we start picking up the scabs, then you start looking at the history of it, and you'll see that specifically as well, Black feminists have been doing that in practice since the 19th century. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming and supporting the event, and the recording should be out in the next week or so. Thank you.